what components actually exist in the contract, as in like what payments exist, and then how do we actually identify. And so we're going to start at the top here. The lessee is going to make a payment of $500,000 on October 24th, 2020. This payment does reduce rent owed under the lease term for a particular month. So because of that, we want to identify what that $500,000 actually means from an accounting perspective. And we don't have to overthink this, right? If we make a payment prior to the lease term beginning, what would that consist of? That would, of course, be prepaid rent. Now, we call that a lease component because that money that we are paying is going directly towards the rental price of that asset. So anytime the money you pay is for the asset itself, that's considered a lease component. So because of that, we want to include that amount in our calculation of the value of the asset. And we'll get to all of that a little bit later on. Second piece, base rent payments of $500,000 commence on the contractual lease commencement date, and they're going to increase every single 12 months thereafter by a specific percentage. So the rent for each month is going to be due on the first day of each month. This is very obvious, right? We are making rent payments for the use of the asset. So yes, these are going to be a lease component, and then these will just simply be considered lease payments. We identify them as lease payments because they occur during the term, which means we're going to capitalize these on our balance sheet at present value to identify a present value of what we owe going forward. Thirdly, the tenant has the right in the contract to use any 120 parking spaces in the garage of the building to be constructed. The total number of parking spaces in the garage is 240. Now, this is a little complex to include in this situation. There's no money involved here, but one thing that we need to remember is with a contract, there is often a need to allocate the total price of a contract to all of the components within it. Now, when we start thinking about what is considered a lease component and what is not, one of the criteria is identifying either an explicit or implicitly identified asset. So when we talk about explicit or implicitly identified, we mean that an asset has to be very specifically identified and physically able to be pointed out. In this situation, because the tenant has the right to any of 120 parking spaces of that garage of 240, effectively the tenant can just use 50% of the parking spaces, right? But there are no specific spaces that the tenant has a reserved space noted for. It's just a parking pass. So because of that, we don't have a very specific parking space we can point to that the tenant controls. The tenant also does not have control of at least 90% of the spaces, so it doesn't have material control over the whole garage. Because of all of this, we are going to consider this just an additional service that the landlord is providing to the lessee. So because of that, it's not going to be considered a lease component. So we do not have to take into consideration the payment for these spaces when capitalizing the value of this lease and in this situation or allocating any of that rent.